If you're in favor of freedom of speech, that means you're in favor of freedom of speech precisely for views you despise. Otherwise, you're not in favor of freedom of speech.
Alright, hey guys, what's up? This is Binghamton Review Live. Sorry about that, we had a few technical difficulties, and our moderator Patrick isn't here yet, so we're just going to start off without him. So today we have two pretty interesting topics for you. I'm going to be covering the events in Saudi Arabia, and Jordan's going to be covering the Brazilian elections, right?
That is correct. That is correct.
Alright, so
I guess I'll go.
Sure.
Oftentimes what I like to do on the show is cover international politics, because American politics we already know a lot about. So it's always interesting to delve into what goes on in the wider world. So, and plus I have a connection to this because there's a person that is very close to me that is from Brazil. So this is for her. So anyway, in the Brazilian elections, you have two. Basically have two finalists, or two for the general election. The two candidates. There's Jair Bolsonaro, who is basically the equivalent to Donald Trump in Brazil, just sort of this sort of right-wing populist kind of guy. And then you also have Fernando Haddad, who is a more Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn type of character. And they're both pretty interesting guys. And in the first round of voting, Bolsonaro won with 46% of the vote, and and Haddad only had 29% of the vote. So it's a really interesting election, because Brazil, for those that don't know the recent history, the party that Haddad belongs to is the Workers' Party. And they are technically a left-wing party, but they are very corrupt, and basically their previous couple of leaders, including, there was a guy, Lula, who in radio terms, I'll put it, he was a butthole, a corrupt butthole, and he basically funneled government taxpayer money into his own bank account. And he pretended like he was, I'm a man of the people, and I'm, gonna unify Brazil again, and we're not gonna, have all this corruption. Meanwhile, he's basically laundering money from his own citizens. So he was recently just jailed for that, for corruption. So I'm very skeptical of both of these candidates, because Bolsonaro, he's very anti-LGBT. He supports the military dictatorship that Brazil had in the 80s. And on the other hand, Haddad comes from the same party that Lula comes from. And Lula was, again, a corrupt butthole, so I don't want Haddad to be that same type of leader, and I'm afraid that that's where they're headed. So this is a really, really important election. October 28th is going to be the runoff election, again, between Bolsonaro and Haddad. So, Matt, I'd like to get your thoughts on this, and then I guess I'll jump back in.
Yeah, sure, and I guess I should mention that our moderator Patrick walked in, so...
Glad to be here, everybody.
Woohoo! Just thought I'd give a shout out, since he didn't say hi in the beginning, but this is a pretty interesting election. I have to admit, I don't really follow Brazil's elections too closely, so I had to do a little research before today's show. But yeah, Bolsonaro, how do you pronounce his last name? Yeah, he's...
Bolsonaro, yep.
Yeah, he's a right-wing populist, as they say. He's Trumpian in a lot of ways, but I don't know, I feel like when I read articles about it, I feel like they use that in a negative way. But in some ways, I don't like him as a candidate, obviously. He's very homophobic. That part is definitely true. He did praise the military dictatorship, which, again, I don't know how like, truthful, or like, I don't know, because he's kind of, it reminds me of the way that Trump just kind of talks. And I don't know if that's how he meant to say it, is if he was just talking or if he actually like supports a military dictatorship. It's hard to tell from just like reading the articles and not actually being in Brazil or not knowing how to speak the language. So I can't like read his tone, but it's similar things with a lot of things he said. The media definitely has attacked him for being racist and sexist, and I haven't really found a lot of things. There might be, and if it is, that's horrible. Like no one is for sexism or racism or homophobia. The homophobia thing is true. Like he blatantly comes out and says it, but the racist and sexist parts, I can't find a lot about. There's like one quote that shows he's sexist, which isn't much. And then I haven't really found much about the racism part. So like personality-wise, I don't love him, but also it's hard for me to actually tell his personality, being an American, just reading articles about it.
Mm-hmm.
But policy-wise, I like him far better than Haddad. He's very law and order, very cracked down on crime, free market. He's talking about how they have to switch from socialism so they don't end up like Venezuela. He says a lot. I found a lot of quotes about him trying to compare Brazil to Venezuela, and there's a lot of corruption in the other party, the Workers' Party. So I guess if it just strictly came down to policy, Bolsonaro wins in a landslide, but both of them I don't really like. I guess I don't really know. It's hard to tell. Bolsonaro will win, it seems. So I don't.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he ran away with it in the first runoff. 46% to 29% for Haddad. And then when it comes to foreign policy, Bolsonaro is pretty pro-America. A lot of people are saying that if Bolsonaro wins, that Brazil and America's ties will grow. So considering I don't like either candidate that much, based on from what I know, I couldn't say I totally support either one. I guess Bolsonaro would be better for the United States as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the reason why I brought up this story in particular is because, not to say that I'm sort of a Haddad fanboy, but I'm actually bringing this up to criticize both of them because I don't like either of them. I don't trust either of them.
Agreed.
And what I wanted to say is there's a big difference, because I've talked about the Labor Party before and the fact that I tepidly support them. I don't really like overall socialist parties, because to me that's sort of anathema to what socialism is actually about, which is worker control over the means of production. And I just don't agree with the whole concept of a socialist party, because again, that's not how it's supposed to work, because socialism, if you look at authors like Kropotkin, Proudhon, Chomsky, they all talk about how we should have a horizontal structure in society, not a vertical structure, and that's what you're going to have if you have these parties that claim to be socialist, but then are really just money laundering firms, and just taking money from taxpayers and then using it to fatten their own wallets. So that is not what I support, and is something that I actually basically despise, because it gives people with views like mine a bad name, because they think when you say, oh, I support socialism, that's what people think. They think Venezuela, they think Brazil, they think Soviet Union, and so the term socialism has been distorted thanks in part to people like Lula and Haddad and the Workers' Party in Brazil, and it's just annoying to me. So that's sort of my little 2 cents about the issue. That's why I'm a little bit salty about it, because it just ruins the reputation of the policies that I try to implement. Like another thing that I like is worker cooperatives, which are different from unions. I've described them as similar to unions in the past, but since I've done more research, it's not like unions in America where they're just government-appointed bureaucrats. That's what unions are. They directly represent the workers. The worker cooperatives do that, so they are different from unions. I don't know why I've gone off on that little side tangent, but the point is that I just totally disagree with the concept of socialist parties, and I'm very skeptical of them. So, Matt?
Yeah, I guess I can see where you're coming from. So, let me ask you, how would you, like, get a government that's, I guess, not socialist to become socialist? Like, I don't believe in socialism either way. I don't think it works in the mainstream way that we think about it, or the way you think about it. But let's say that I wanted to make my government the way that you think about it. In your country, like Brazil, wouldn't you need a socialist party to take control first in order to transform the format of the government?
Unless it's
If you wanted
revolution
to. Okay, yeah.
Um,
That's another way.
Yeah. There are multiple ways to go about it. There's, like, social democratic parties, which I think are better than socialist parties. You could have a social democratic party to transition from a, again, social democratic society to a stateless society, but I don't think, like, socialist parties are the way to go about doing that, because they, again, invariably just end up being these giant cesspools of corruption by politicians who take advantage of vulnerable working people. So, I guess that's the best answer I could give you.
Alright, fair enough. And I do just want to point out that revolution comment that we made is a joke. None of us are pro-revolution. Just the way that the media works now, somebody's going to pull that up 20 years from now and
Yeah,
claim that we all
up.
that we
Revolution time. No,
Yeah.
not
It's a
really.
joke. I just have to make sure.
I mean, you know, to the Bolsheviks, etc.
I mean,
it wasn't really a joke. Though.
yeah. No, I
It
was
wasn't
gonna
a
say,
joke.
because I do kind of.
Uh-oh.
Well,
Well,
yeah, it wasn't a joke is in like the historical sense is that it's happened before, but it was a joke for me anyway that no one's like I'm not pro-revolution.
I appreciate it.
right.
So just gotta make sure.
Yeah. Well, all right. Why don't we move on to that was Jordan's topic, correct? Correct. We'll
Yes.
move on to Matt's topic. You were doing Saudi Arabia, right?
Saudi Arabia, yes. So personally, I think this is the toughest foreign policy decision that the Trump administration has had to face, and one of the toughest foreign policy decisions that any U.S. president has had to face in a while. And the reason is because most of them, if you're a Democrat, there's a right way, and if you're a Republican, there's a right way. Like everyone has an opinion on it.
Right.
But this way, like both sides, like you have to admit, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place either way. Either way, you're doing something wrong. So the background is that a Saudi Arabian citizen who is a U.S. resident, he wrote for the Washington Post. He went to Turkey, to Istanbul. It was a Saudi consulate in Turkey. I think it was to get like a marriage license or a divorce license or something like that, paperwork. And Turkey came out and said that they have evidence that the Saudi Arabian government sent 15 people to kill him and cut him up, and he's disappeared now. And Turkey says they have like physical evidence and audio recording of the event happening. I don't really know how they would have gotten an audio recording.
Yeah.
I guess because it's in like a consulate building. But
I think there'd be more video to supplement the audio.
yeah, I don't know. I'm just gonna have to assume they're right at this point because if they're saying it, then that means they're willing to give it up to America to do
Right.
something about it. I'm not gonna like try to ignore the fact that Turkey is anti-Saudi Arabia in the first place, but I mean none of us would really be surprised if Saudi Arabia actually did this. So it's left the Trump administration with two extreme options, and then a bunch of people like proposing like options in the middle. One option is to completely break ties with Saudi Arabia, which a lot of Republican senators have suggested, like Rand Paul, Marco Rubio. The other one is to just ignore it, because Saudi Arabia is too big of an ally, too big of a geopolitical point in the world, and if we break ties with them, there are serious global ramifications. And then there are a couple of them in the middle where it's like, sanction them until they explain and make reforms, and we believe them, make terms to it, and then we can unsanction them. But it's really tough. I mean, I think I have my opinion, but again, you're between a rock and a hard place. You're doing something wrong either way. If you choose to do nothing, then there are like moral consequences of that. I mean, they killed an American resident, they killed a person in general. And if you do something, then there could be like thousands of more deaths, depending on if you lose this point in the Middle East, could like change tides, and I'm probably gonna get into that more later when I actually explain which way I'm leaning towards. But I guess I'll ask Jordan, what do you think?
Yeah, this whole situation is a disaster. I mean, and what I don't like is the whole hypocrisy from mostly Republicans. Like I saw Lindsey Graham yesterday. He was talking about how I can't support Saudi Arabia anymore because of this. And I'm like, Lindsey, that's what made you pull your support for Saudi Arabia? So it wasn't the genocide in Yemen. It wasn't the fact that Saudi Arabia most likely gave Al-Qaeda money and arms to carry out 9/11. Like, so that stuff's fine. That stuff's fine because they're our ally. But, but this is the thing that sent you over the edge. Why weren't you calling out their actions before that? Why were you not talking about going into Congress and talking about the genocide in Yemen? Why were you not talking about their actions on 9/11? Why are you not talking about the fact that they are the number one sponsor of Wahhabi terrorism in the world, which is extreme Sunni Islam? So I was really, really angry with Lindsey Graham when I heard him say that, and I just don't, it's just, obviously, I've mentioned on the show before, I'm very, very anti-Saudi Arabia, and I actually, even though I just yelled at Lindsey Graham, I kind of agree with him, and I agree with somebody that's more consistent on this issue, like Rand Paul, where why are we, why do we continue to arm and fund these guys who, by the way, meddle in our elections all the time? Like, I hear the media still to this day going on about, oh, Russian meddling. Saudi Arabia does, Israel does, but we love them, so the media says nothing about it. So this really just irritates me.
I'm gonna have to disagree with most of that. So, the reason that this would make a lot of Republican senators like this is the straw that broke the camel's back is because it has to do with the U.S. resident, because it is kind of like an attack on foreign soil. A lot of the other things, like the 9/11 thing, is still a conspiracy. Like, yes, 15 out of the 19 plane hijackers were Saudi Arabian, but the connection to the Saudi government is still kind of a conspiracy. Them funding terrorism, they're not the number one state sponsor of terrorism. They are, like, you were correct, but the number one state sponsor of general terrorism is Iran, and that comes to the point of why Saudi Arabia is such a major ally, or one of the reasons why they're such a major ally, is because there's actually a Cold War happening in the Middle East, like an actual legitimate Cold War, where there's the two big countries who hate each other, who have completely different ideals, and they're fighting little proxy wars around them, but not actually declaring war on each other. If you literally zoom into the Middle East, it's the definition of a Cold War. When Russia's backing one side's the side that wants to take over the entire Middle East. One side's the side that wants to take over our ally of Israel. One side's the side that's chanting death to America and wants nukes. And the other side's the side that wants the status quo, and that's Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia didn't want... They believe that they were already the Islamic State because they had the two major Islamic cities. So they weren't actually trying to change anything until Iran actually started to push back. So that's kind of the reason why this is, from a geopolitical and a realist point of view, you can't break ties with Saudi Arabia. You would lose so much. Iran would gain a huge upper hand, which there's like baby consequences and there's big consequences. The baby consequences that worst case scenario, Iran takes over the Middle East, or they start taking over countries around the Middle East, like Iraq. There's no real formal government there. Yemen, they can take over, which is actually why there's a genocide in Yemen, is because Iran went in first and took over the government. They overthrew the government, and Saudi Arabia went in. It's a proxy war there. I mean, if we're going to argue about Saudi Arabian interference in Yemen, then you got to argue about United States interference in every proxy war in the Cold War, which there were like 20 of them. I don't think we could really argue about the moral place of proxy wars. That's just the way it is when it comes to war sometimes, and it sucks. Like, I'm not gonna lie, but to say that we have to pull out support of an ally because they're in proxy wars makes no sense to me. And then the big consequences is that Russia is the one pushing through Iran, through Syria, in order to get Iran's control of the Middle East, which would give Russia a foothold in the Middle East, which would give them more waterways, more area, more of a sphere of influence. And not that we're in a Cold War with Russia right now, but there is an informal kind of standoff between us. Russia is one of our biggest political allies on the international stage, and giving them more land, giving them more access to resources, more waterways, control over more people, plus Iran taking over a bunch of our allies, including Israel, it just makes no sense. I mean, our one hope of keeping this stalemate, where there's not a huge war that happens, where there's not a huge takeover of our allies, where there's not a huge geopolitical gain for Russia, Saudi Arabia is our only hope. I mean, they're the ones who first claimed in the Middle East that Israel has the right to be there. They were the first ones to propose an alliance of all the Sunni states, Palestine and Israel, to check Iran. I mean, this makes a ton of sense, not even talking about the economic parts of why we need to keep our alliance with Saudi Arabia. I mean, we are hugely tied to them, with oil, of course, but with a ton of other things like our businesses as well. I do think something has to be done, because there's like the rock of, if we break our ties with Saudi Arabia, we could lose all of that. I mean, that's not something we could really give up. But then the hard place is that if we don't do anything at all, then we lose our credibility, we lose our credibility on human rights, and it basically tells Saudi Arabia that they can do whatever they want, and we won't do anything. Like, we do have leverage over Saudi Arabia. You can't put them in a position where they can do what they want, or where they have leverage over us. So we have to do something, but not break ties with them, not to a point where there's a difference in our alliance, besides forcing them to reform or forcing them to not do these awful things.
I just wanted to jump in fast. I like how you said Cold War, because that sort of reminded me of something. Like, you know how U.S. would always prop up, right-wing dictatorships in our Cold War with the Soviet Union, where they would have their socialist potential government, and then CIA. Oh, wow, what a shame when your democratically elected leader gets killed by the CIA, type of thing.
Yeah.
The classic. It's the situation isn't great, but if your main goal is to stop the spread of communism, or to stop the spread of the hashtag Death to America, that's sort of the moral choice that you have to consider. Do you stick with Saudi Arabia, a country with terrible human rights practices that killed one of our own residents, or do you try to find a middle way, or do you just say nothing? That type of thing.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily right now, given the reality of the situation, I'm not for completely severing ties with Saudi Arabia, but I am for massive sanctions. I really am. I think that's now that, of course, that could result in Saudi Arabia sanctioning us, but that's why I'm saying this whole thing is a mess. And I guess my point about the whole, how should I put this? The point is, if Iran did this, you'd have people on both parties, really, calling for regime change like that, and we'd be already sending troops. There'd already be troops on the ground overthrowing the Iranian government. So if this happened in Iran, or if or it was sponsored, if you will, by Iran, we would be just calling for regime change like that. But since it's since it's Saudi Arabia, they get to do whatever they want, and we kind of sort of say, oh, we are going to punish you, and I'm not very optimistic about that. I think we're just gonna end up letting it go, because we always cave to them.
How? When have we ever let them go?
We always do it. Like I said, the genocide in Yemen.
That's a proxy war. Like, Iran is equally, actually more at fault for that. They went in first and took over the Yemen.
But the thing is, Matt, do you understand the difference between, we can control what Saudi Arabia does. We can't control what Iran does. Iran's going to do what Iran's going to do. It sucks. It's terrible. But they're going to do. But since we have sway with Saudi Arabia, we can maybe at least try to get them to stop this reckless behavior that they're doing.
Which
Like,
part's
do you
reckless?
understand? Yeah, like
Which part's reckless?
carrying out a genocide.
Going in
Yeah.
and fighting a war for a country that just got taken over? Like, Yemen's not a part of this war. They're just not. I'm sorry. This is literally just a war between Iran and the people they're funding, and Saudi Arabia and the people they're funding in the land of Yemen.
Right, but Saudi Arabia is
we're
blocking
supporting-
food and medicine and supplies.
That's because
into
Iran
Yemen.
holds the government. That's how you win a war.
Like,
That's you kill people in wars. What happens? It sucks. I'm sorry. I'm not for it. I wish we had a world without war. But when we have a world with war, how about you pick the side that you want to win? I personally want the side to win that doesn't want to kill us, or the side that protects Israel's right to be there, or the side that's against Russian control of the entire Middle East. Like I'm for Saudi Arabia winning the war in Yemen and in Iraq.
what's the disadvantage to Russia controlling the Middle East? So what? Let them do it. So what? You
That's
know,
not how
that-
geopolitics works.
that-
I mean, what I'm learning in one of my classes right now is every world hegemon declines. Like, it's inevitable. And we went through, like, all the math that shows that literally every hegemon in the world declines and a challenger rises. And the hegemon can take it back. Britain did it twice. Britain was the hegemon, declined, and then rose back up as the hegemon for the second time in a row. A hegemon being the world power. So what happens as the United States starts to decline and China and Russia start to increase? China and Russia are on the same side. They've already said it. We're just going to lose a war to them because now Russia has all of Asia, all of the Middle East, and we have just us? I mean, it makes no sense. Like, you have to control... geopolitics is a huge part of the game. When it comes to trade, like, what happens if we lose 4 of our major allies? Saudi Arabia, Israel. What happens when they can get to Europe really quickly? It just makes no sense to let an enemy of ours, a country who's one of the U.S.'s main enemies, have that much economic and political control, a lot of it over the U.S., and directly taking over our allies. And a country that wants to kill us, literally chanting death to America.
Well, it just... I had something that I wanted to say and I can't remember, and we're probably going to run out of time, so, but... yeah, so... I don't know, but,
Regardless, I
Oh,
agree with you.
now I know what I was going to say. Okay, sorry.
Very quickly, very quickly.
Okay. So that's why I support, for instance, you were talking about Saudi Arabia and oil. That's why I support getting off of fossil fuels, so we're not dependent on a country like Saudi Arabia, so we don't have to rely on foreign oil.
Yeah, let's talk about that stuff another week.
That's,
Yeah.
That's a good topic we can talk about.
Yeah.
We just had a talk on campus about how to solve the climate change problem. So definitely might have to bring that up at a later time.
I would love to.
Very very excellent. So thank you all for tuning in. Sorry for my tardiness, but glad you stuck around. We hope to see you again next week. Have you hear us again next week. But yeah, anyway, have a lovely night, and we'll catch you around.